This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Stan Veuger from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., a phronistarian, to use Aristophanes' word for think tank.
That's right.
Yeah, and he's an economist. He's from the Netherlands, so he graduated from college in there in where I see. In Utrecht and
right.
in Rotterdam.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And but he got his PhD in Harvard in the economics department in 2012, working under Professor Martin Feldstein. And so here he is today. He's written a number of papers and publications for AEI and published in different reviews. Among them, I especially note a defense of our hero Tom Brady on the Deflategate false pseudo scandal of a few years ago.
Journal of Sport Analytics.
That's right, and I understand he has another article coming out on LeBron James.
Yeah.
So, but he does. He's an economist who does. He's, how should I say, not an economic political scientist, as there are too many of in our department, but a politic economist who is, yes, an economist, but thinks very well politically. And he's going to talk today about health care and tax reform in the 115th Congress. So, Stan Veuger.
Thank you very much, Harvey, and thank you for having me here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I hope the mic situation is good. Yes? All right. Excellent. So yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about health and tax policy in this Congress. My opening remarks will be about 20 minutes. Those will be focused on policy, and then afterwards in the Q&A we can discuss the politics of the matter a little more. I have 20 minutes to discuss all of healthcare policy and all of tax policy. Fortunately, only as it applies to the United States. I'm going to assume that most of you, have followed these debates to some extent, and I'm just going to highlight a few of the big questions and what's going to come in the next year. So this is more of a current affairs discussion than I think is typical for this group. And so let's get started. So in November, the Republicans, even though I don't think really expected it themselves, suddenly gained control of both houses of Congress and of the White House, and they immediately switched gears and started thinking, okay, now we can pass our entire agenda. So if you talked to especially House Republicans in January, they would say, okay, we're going to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act in February. Then in March, we're going to do tax reform. In April, we're going to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And then in May, we'll start going down the list of other priorities we have. That was optimistic, but in previous similar situations where both Congress and the White House were controlled by the same party, certainly early on in administration, a lot of legislation actually did get passed on big issues. So under Clinton, even when his healthcare reform plans sort of fell apart, it still passed gun control, don't ask, don't tell, family medical leave, NAFTA. And the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So he's probably the least impressive of these four. But if you look at Obama in his first 2 years in office, passed a massive stimulus bill, repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, passed financial sector regulation, and passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, right? Massive reorganization of the healthcare sector. So far, what legislation have we seen during the Trump administration? A few retractions of regulations through the Congressional Review Act. This is what House Republicans were really proud of in April. And then Russia sanctions that they didn't really want. Certainly the president didn't want, but that Congress forced upon him. And that's the entire harvest so far. Now, what has happened to those original legislative objectives that I mentioned? There's the Affordable Care Act, repeal and replace. That has, I guess, basically failed. The tax reform plans have gone from very comprehensive and truly transformative to we're going to cut a number of rates, and then we're going to reshuffle some money around to, from the other side's preferred groups to our preferred groups. The infrastructure spending bill that people were very high on, and that was really, the core of the populist Trumpian agenda, I think has now been indefinitely delayed. There's been no substantive progress. It's not clear that any of this is going to happen, certainly not in this Congress. And then the perhaps core of the campaign side of the Trumpist agenda, the border wall, whatever, the Muslim ban, some sort of immigration reform bill, none of that has happened yet. And instead, it's quite possible that we'll see the DACA executive order under Obama being turned into legislation with the continuing resolution a few months from now, right? So this doesn't look like a legislative agenda that is going ahead swimmingly, and so I'm going to talk today a little bit about how that happened and what elements look more likely to still be salvageable and which ones don't. So what was the strategy Republicans adopted around April, May? They said, okay, healthcare reform turns out wasn't as easy as we thought. We're going to run into trouble in the Senate, perhaps, with Democrats, so we're going to go through the budget reconciliation process. This will only require 51 votes in the Senate, or even 50 plus Pence. It'll limit what we can do in terms of the content of the legislation, but it'll make it procedurally easier. And then we're going to have a second reconciliation bill for the 2018 fiscal year, which they, could have passed in February, but ended up passing just 2 days ago, yesterday, I think, when the House budget, yesterday, the House passed the concurrent resolution. And so they gambled on this process that required only Republican votes, but restricted what they could do legislatively, certainly for healthcare reform, right? So under the budget reconciliation process, only elements of legislation that are directly relevant to budgetary outlays are allowed to be incorporated. Plus, there cannot be an impact on the deficit more than 10 years out, right? So both of those things restrict what you can do in terms of repealing regulations, writing new laws to force people to do things, and they limit what you can do permanently because you have this no addition to the deficit restriction 10 years out. And so in healthcare reform, that's very important. So many of the things the Affordable Care Act did are of the purely regulatory variety. Right? So there are essential health benefits that need to be in health insurance policies now, and those are regulated those are to some extent regulated by statute. Similarly, you're not allowed to discriminate against potential consumers with pre-existing conditions within the Obamacare individual exchanges. So all of those things you cannot repeal through the reconciliation process, and so they meant that Congress had to work around those things. And that led to the trouble early on in the healthcare reform process, because by keeping the basic infrastructure in place, right? So the individual exchanges that were created under the Affordable Care Act in particular, by keeping that in place, it was hard to keep senators on the sort of libertarian right on board with the repeal process. And so in the first rendition of the healthcare repeal bill, the Medicare Reconciliation Act, Senator Lee, for example, from Utah, who's certainly not a pinko commie, voted against the Repeal Act because he felt that it was going to keep too much in place. And the process kind of went on from there. So there were people on the sort of libertarian side of the party who felt like the reform bill didn't go far enough. There's people on the more moderate, or people in states that benefited more from the Affordable Care Act who were skeptical about changes that led to coverage losses. And so the Republicans just never really came to a solution that fit all the wishes and desires and dreams of all 52 or at least 50 senators. Perhaps that was impossible, but certainly within the guardrails imposed by the reconciliation process, that turned out to be the case. I want to, for a moment, emphasize that to a large extent, that's not necessarily because the policy writing was done poorly. Right? There were real restrictions under which they were working. One, their own campaign promises. And so Republicans for a long time argued for, ran on repeal and replace, which implies fundamental changes to the system as it stood, not just marginal changes that they may have been able to pass, but didn't even consider because they wanted something big. Second, because of this almost obsessive focus on Obamacare repeal and replace, all of the sort of policy-oriented energy went only to the individual market and Medicaid, which are the two parts of the healthcare market affected by the Affordable Care Act. But that's only in total, including the Medicaid expansion in the Affordable Care Act, only about a quarter of the total health insurance market. Right? So there's a lot of things you cannot do if you're only focused on the demand side of 25% of the market. Right? So providers and prices are their behavior and their levels are shaped by things like Medicare, by the private insurance market, and so none of that was ever the topic of thought or even of policymaking in these efforts. And so that makes it very, if you're dealing with sort of prices that are kind of set, provider networks that are kind of set, then it's very difficult to come up with alternatives that lower premiums, increase coverage, lower deductibles, all these promises that Republicans accumulated over 7 years of campaigning against the Affordable Care Act. And then thirdly, a constraint they ran into is that obviously this is a program that benefited not just people in blue states. The Medicaid expansion, in a sense, I think you can think of as representatives from blue states forcing red states to cover their constituents, to provide health insurance to their constituents. Many of the blue states already had pretty extensive Medicaid programs before the Affordable Care Act, and the expansions that were to a large extent that were funded by the Affordable Care Act mostly applied to red states, and some of the red states took the expansion. Kentucky, for example, is a good example of this, and so they benefited from that a lot. Now, in addition, the red states are a lot of the red states are pretty poor, so there's a lot of, because the Medicaid limits are set based on federal income levels, there's a lot of people you can cover in Alabama if you let people be covered up to 133% of the federal poverty rate, because that's about the median income in Alabama or Mississippi. Anyway, so all of those restrictions taken together were just created a puzzle that was impossible for Republicans to fix. So they spent till the end of September, when their budget reconciliation process reached its end, they came up with different constellations of reform policies, and ultimately it all petered out, and they couldn't pass anything. So obviously, they spent 7 years claiming this is the worst piece of domestic legislation in history almost. So it's really weird to now just walk away from it and say, okay, well, we were joking. It's actually the best we can come up with too. So I think it's going to be very difficult for them to just walk away and not come up with other fixes and things. And they have to come up with things that go beyond just pure sabotage of the individual market. Because ultimately, what drove a lot of the genuine frustration about the legislation were premiums and available policies in the individual market for people who did not receive subsidies. And so in the individual market that's constituted under the Affordable Care Act, as long as you're below 400% of the federal poverty line, you get premium subsidies and cost sharing reduction subsidies that basically shield you from increases in costs from the expansion of coverage to people with high medical costs and to price increases. That's not true for people above that 400% And the people above that 400% who buy in the small group or individual market are exactly the kind of people who, who vote, who donate, who complain to their congressmen, and who organize politically. So I don't see how this is a stable equilibrium, right, where the entire infrastructure is in place, and if anything, the thing driving most of the fury is performing worse than it was before. But so that's healthcare policy. Nothing has been done, and the situation, if anything, is deteriorating. Now, on tax reform, Republicans have decided to adopt the same strategy that they adopted with healthcare reform, because there's great success. They're going through the budget reconciliation process again. Now, in fairness, it's easier in tax reform to go through that process than in healthcare reform, because basically every tax provision has a budgetary impact, and so you can change it through this process in a way that you cannot do on the healthcare side. You are still bound by the no increase in the deficit more than 10 years out, and so that restricts what you can do, certainly on the corporate tax side, because on the as some of you probably know, in corporate taxation, there are a lot of, if you purchase an asset, you typically don't get to expense to deduct the costs, the price you paid from your profits in year one. The asset depreciates, and so over up to a 7-year period, you incur costs from the purchase. Now, because that is the case, a corporate tax rate cut in year 4 still has a revenue impact in year 11. Right. So what Republicans cannot do is just say, okay, we're going to cut the corporate tax rate for 10 years, and then we bet that whoever is in office then will just extend it, because that would have revenue implications well beyond the 10th year through depreciation and loss carry forwards and things like that. So what could they do if their goal really is to only cut the corporate tax rate? They could say, okay, we do it for 3 years, then we call it quits. Now, that's not ambitious enough, because what Republicans have long told themselves is that they want to fundamentally transform the U.S. tax system, much like they have long promised themselves they want to fundamentally transform the U.S. healthcare system. So again, back in January and February, House Republicans had a blueprint, as they called it, for a better way tax system. And that blueprint was very ambitious, right? So it completely changed the basic concepts of the way in which we treat corporations in the tax code. It changed the system from one of worldwide taxation to one that's only territorial, one that taxed value added not where it originated on the production side, but where it was consumed on the consumer side. It taxed products where at their final destination, not their origin, and it taxed cash flow instead of income. This is a good smooth term. It was a destination-based cash flow tax, and this is like a genuine fundamental transformation. Plus, it had the advantage that it generated revenue in ways that would make it relatively attractive to enact. One big source of revenue in this system is the so-called border adjustment, which makes it so that if you import things, the value added generated abroad basically gets taxed upon entry into the U.S. And so if you run a trade deficit, as the U.S. does, that gives you a lot of revenue, right? Because you basically give people a subsidy when they export, right? Because that value added is now going to a different destination that the U.S. no longer taxes, because it taxes territorially things that are destined for the United States. And so the Republicans suddenly thought, okay, we have this bag of money, the border adjustment tax. Right? It was about 1.4 trillion in the budget window. And they said, okay, we're going to use that, and then we're going to lower rates to 20%. That's a great corporate tax plan, basically pays for itself. And that's something we can really run on. We didn't add to the deficit. We got taxes down to 20%, which is on the low side for OECD, as opposed to what it is now, 35%, which is the highest. But then people started saying, oh, but what is this border adjustment? It sounds a lot like a tariff. Retailers started freaking out because they import a lot of their products from abroad, and we're suddenly going to have to pay this tax. Now, some of the big retailers you may know. Walmart, for example, is in Arkansas. Arkansas has 2 Republican senators. if Walmart declares something to be the most important issue in American politics, and those two senators, well, you know, they're not happy about the thing. If Walmart thinks it's bad, Home Depot's in South Carolina has 2 Republican senators, and yeah, so then ended up 12 people in the Senate were on board with this tax plan. And so, you know, the Republicans just said, okay, fine, then we're not changing the system. So instead of going to a cash flow system, they said, fine, we're just going to continue taxing income. Instead of going to a real territorial system, they're now going to a system where they say, okay, we tax income in the US, but you can't just move all of your income abroad, so we're going to write rules to keep you from doing that. And so instead of having, you know, this fundamentally different, like almost idealized, economist thought up tax plan, they are now back to sort of the boring accounting of coming up with rules so that the corporate tax base doesn't get eroded. They also, you know, they went back from destination-based taxation to origin-based taxation, and they needed, you know, some revenue, so they went to the individual side of the tax code to find revenue raisers there after they gave up on their big border adjustment pile of money. So this all happened around June, and it's, you know, it's a big moment because they basically gave up on their dream of a fundamental tax reform plan through internal infighting over a plan that had been, you know, sitting on a website for 2 years. And there's no, this is not good policymaking. Like the healthcare thing, I can kind of understand, but this was really, they were bargaining with themselves in a way that I don't think you should have to do if you're a properly organized political party in control of all the relevant parts of the government. Anyway, so now we're at the current plan. The current plan, they still want to go then reduce the corporate tax rate to 20%. Where does that 20% come from? From their qualitatively completely different plan that they came up with a year ago. Now, to do that and to not lose too much revenue, especially after 10 years, they need to they need to eliminate what people like to call loopholes in the tax code. All those loopholes are things that people really like. It's things like you don't get taxed on your employer-provided health insurance. You don't get taxed on the imputed rental income from living in your own house. You don't get taxed on, you get to deduct your mortgage interest payments. So, you know, Republicans started writing this new plan, and then, you know, they put out a framework again about a month ago now. And what did we discover there? None of those things are in there except for the state and local tax deductibility. Why that one? Because, you know, the states that have the highest state and local taxes are Democratic, right? It's New York, New Jersey, California. And so, you know, you can, by not letting people deduct those taxes, you can raise revenue, and it comes from your political enemies, or at least from groups that you don't like. Of course, there's a bunch of House members from those states, but they overlooked that for a moment. That's really the only real, you know, loophole they're eliminating at this point. And they are using this money to cut the corporate tax rate in a new territorial system with complicated rules, and to create a new separate tax category for pass-through entities, which is, you know, business income that is declared on the individual side. Why do they like that? So you should think of it as follows, right? What they're doing is they're trying to take revenue from highly paid professionals in New York City and give it to car dealers in Arkansas. That's the idea. You know, that's fine. It's the political party that gets more votes from one group than the other. But it is not, you know, moving us toward a platonic form of the tax system, which is what they started out with doing. So, you know, at this point, it looks like we're down to a corporate tax cut and then some reshuffling on the individual side in a way that I think is disappointing to people who wanted to see these sort of idealized plans that Republicans have been working on for the last 10 years materialize. And what we can discuss is, why did this happen? Is this because the platform Republicans posted on their website a year and a half ago is not actually the platform people ended up voting for when they voted for Trump? Is it just, you know, the Senate margin is thin, it's difficult to get things passed? Is it because the president is not actively leading, or is he not actively engaged, or does he not really understand the policies? I think those would be good topics to discuss, but I'm open to anything. Okay.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Yes.
Thanks. That was very illuminating about the failures of the past couple months. I'm just wondering, in the counterfactual world in which Hillary won, and the Republicans had the same victories in the House and Senate, they still had both chambers. Would it look pretty much exactly as it looks today? So that is, would the legislative landscape have been pretty much the same the first year of the administration, or would there have been more of a chance of some kind of grand bargain where the Republicans recognize they have to make some kind of deal? Would they have kept doing what they had done during the Obama administration?
I think I think it would have looked mostly the same. I think Hillary would have vetoed the CRAs that they passed, and I think a lot of time would have been consumed by the impeachment process. but otherwise, I think it would have looked the same. Yeah. Which is pretty shocking when you think of it. Because of course, what Republicans could have done, they didn't do, is end the legislative filibuster. But that way, they would have gotten rid of the guardrails imposed by the reconciliation process. They could have rewritten the entire healthcare system from scratch in any way they wanted. Clearly, there's reasons why they didn't do that, right? Because if there were 51 Republican senators or 52 who agreed on healthcare policy, then they probably would have gone down that route. But clearly they don't. And I think it's important to remember it's not that there were three Republicans they couldn't convince. It was different constellations of senators who voted against the three bills or voted against the motion to proceed. And so it adds up to 10, 11 senators who voted no, probably 25 who were opposed to one of the bills if they had been the deciding vote. Right, so I think, they're just, I don't know what they could have agreed on that Hillary would have signed either, right? There's just different, because I think it's a little easier on the tech side, but on the healthcare side, I don't know what they could have done. Yes.
Do you think the healthcare bills that were put forth, given all the constraints, would any or all of those have actually been beneficial for the healthcare system, or would they not have kind of? The impression I had was that they weren't really going to solve the problems in Obamacare or Pension Healthcare Act, but they were going to institutionalize it. The Republicans have now accepted it; they've joined in owning it. Whereas now there's somewhat more of a chance in future for a different, maybe a voucher or tax credit type system.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And I mean, in part it is because they were working within this framework. And so I think the combination of being bound by, we have to repeal and replace the entire layer of policies that was added onto the system in 2010, and the guardrails of reconciliation process, I think that combination was really difficult. Because obviously there are simple things they could have done. If you want to cut Medicaid, you can cut Medicaid. You don't have to go through a whole thing where you make everyone mad in the individual exchanges. But they just didn't do that. They could have just repealed the individual. They could have changed the fine associated with the individual mandate. They didn't do that. I don't know. I mean, part of it is that I think healthcare is an area where there's a lot of senators who just aren't that interested. So weird to say. I don't know. John McCain voted against the second one, I guess, famously. John McCain doesn't care about healthcare policy. But so the negative press generated by the fact that there was certainly not a Pareto improvement in policy from the changes they proposed. I think that really made it difficult. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
First, thanks for your talk, which was excellent, and this reminds me of a dialogue that I had with a guest, I think going back to 2013. At the time, I read a number of papers from places like AEI about healthcare and was impressed by the arguments advanced about restoring competition to healthcare markets that would benefit patients and doctors, reduce bureaucracy and so on. And the guest made the argument to me that was somewhat bracing, which he said that the Republican Party is a party of protest and not a serious governing party. And I bristled at this because I thought, well, there's some great thought going on at think tanks and so forth. So the question that I have for you is, now, 2017, with Republicans in control of Congress and the presidency, was he right? Or is it a lack of presidential leadership from the vantage of if Obama or Clinton or another Republican who had Obama-like or Clinton-like talents, would we actually have the Republicans as a successful governing party delivering something more like what these papers about competition and so forth promised?
I think he's right in the following sense. I think that I think congressional Republicans really got trapped in that rhetoric around the Affordable Care Act. And by focusing so much on the Medicaid expansion and on the individual market, you limit yourself to changes that are on the demand side for a relatively small sided market, right? So nothing in any of these three bills is focused on providers. But a reason why health insurance takes up a massive chunk of GDP in the U.S., why people are furious because their premiums eat up all wage growth, basically year after year after year, is because every single provider is paid more than in any other country, right? And to a large extent, those prices are set on the Medicare side. Right? The Medicare is a massive chunk of the market. It's all of the old people. The old people spend a lot of money on healthcare. They're an important part of the customer base for the healthcare system. So if you basically nationalize the insurance side of that part of the market, and you set prices there for every provider in the country, then that's a big constraint on what you can do, with little bits of demand for 26-year-olds. So I think in that sense they trap themselves. Is it a serious governing party? Well, I don't. It doesn't look very good so far.
Could you discuss please, the politics of the president's decision not to pay the subsidies that Congress never appropriated money for?
Yes. So during the years when Republicans did not have the presidency and they were very unhappy about the Affordable Care Act, there was a wide range of legal attacks they came up with to keep the law from functioning as intended. Right, and some of them were very successful. So, for example, the mandatory Medicaid expansion up to 133% of the poverty rate got struck down by the Supreme Court. That was a very big chunk of the original bill. They also went after smaller things, and in this case, I think they correctly identified a drafting error. So under the current system, if you're in the exchanges, you get a premium subsidy that you use to buy health insurance, and then there is also a cap on out-of-pocket payments that is maintained by having the insurers basically subsidize their customers. That second set of subsidies was authorized by Congress, but the money was never appropriated. And so these are the so-called CSRs, the cost-sharing reduction subsidies that the president decided to stop paying because, as you're saying, they weren't appropriated. So that's a completely reasonable decision. Now, of course, the president did this last month after paying these subsidies for 7 months after coming into office. Why would he do that? I think there is a broad consensus that as long as we have the current individual market setup in place, those subsidies play a valuable role. It's cheaper to pay them than to not pay them because these subsidies go to everyone. So if you currently have a silver plan in the individual market, you pay a certain premium and then you have an out of pocket amount of spending. the CSRs make it so that your premium is reduced, right? Because you need to pay less of a premium because part of the spending is taken care of by the CSRs. Once you remove the CSRs, your premium goes up. With the premium, your premium subsidies go up, right? So those have been appropriated. But the premium subsidies don't just go up for people with silver plans, because everyone gets the same premiums and they're tied to the price of a silver plan. So in response to eliminating the CSRs, the premium credits also go up for people with bronze plans and gold plans, right? So now the government the government will end up spending more on all of those premium credits than it ever did on the cost-sharing subsidies. So this is why there was a broad consensus it was a bad idea to repeal them. Now, I think the politics are such that Republicans were fine with paying these, or even the Republicans who hated these plans the most, as long as they had the sense that it was transitory, right? That the Affordable Care Act was going to be repealed, and so that we wouldn't have to worry about this thing at all. Of course, that didn't happen, and then a month later, the president says again we're going to stop paying them. So I think that's what shifted. Then, in addition, of course, the White House went through different layers of staffing. I think that may have changed things a little bit. I think John Kelly is more comfortable with something like this on the domestic policy front than Ryan Priebus would have been. I think Priebus would have been more sensitive to concerns about this. There is no HHS secretary to serve as a counterweight against this. I think Trump just wanted to do something to.
But when the people's payments go up, are they going to blame the Democrats or are they going to blame Trump?
I assume they'll blame Trump. Right? So, because that's the second implication of this. The premium increases are going to affect not only people who receive subsidies, right? Because those people are basically made whole because the subsidies go up when the CSRs disappear. But the premium is also going to go up for people outside who make more than 4 times the poverty rate. And so those people are going to be mad because their premiums are, as we've seen over the last few days, their premiums are going to go up by 30%. And presumably if they see through what's happening on the healthcare front, they'll blame Trump. The only, I think, way Republicans have out of this is that these premium increases have been happening for the last few years. And so you can just claim that it's something that's continuing. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough to say, okay, those premium increases, those are still Obama's fault, but when the stock market keeps going up, that's us. I don't know how much they want to run on this is still Obama's economy. Yes.
Yeah, is there much discussion in Washington about this proposal with respect to pass-throughs? Because it seems to me that that's a really big item, which that was essentially a major undoing of the Kansas reduction. There was an article that the new coach for Kansas State came in and he set up a limited liability company, and all of a sudden he wasn't paying any taxes on his.
Kansas. It wasn't Kansas State.
Pardon?
It was Kansas.
It was Kansas. But it seems to me that first of all, I think this has to be an absolute drafting nightmare. And as a background, I was a tax attorney for about 15 years, so I have some familiarity with these. In order to try to restrict it supposedly to what the traditional S corporation is. But I think even beyond that, and I've seen some reference that they might have not only a portion of the income would be taxed at the 25%, because fundamentally it's if you own an S corporation, you own this auto dealership. Part of what you're receiving is comp for what you've done, and part of it is profits with respect to the company. So I don't know. I've seen a few articles, but I haven't seen a lot of focus on this.
So
maybe.
Yeah. So there's definitely a thing that people discuss, but for now I think it's very limited to the specialized tax journalists and the various tax policy people. It hasn't really gotten out of that group. So one big difference with Kansas is that this pass-through rate, if it becomes 25%, of course, it only makes a relevant difference for people who now face rates that are higher than 25%. In Kansas, everyone had an incentive to move toward being a pass-through entity because it completely wiped out your state income tax liability. Right. So that's I think one big difference. I agree with you that writing rules to distinguish wage income and capital income is a nightmare, but I think that's the route they're going down, right? So they're going to say, well, depending on the effects and circumstances, this is business income, this is not. There are alternative options on the table. So, as you said, there's one proposal where your pass-through income will automatically be considered to be 70% wage income, 30% capital income. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's it's ridiculous criterion in the sense that different industries are very different. Ultimately, the only reason why this is happening is because there are people who think that they would stand to benefit from this rule change, and they believe that if the C Corp rate comes down, then their businesses need to get tax relief as well. There's something to be said for that, except that we've seen over the last few decades this massive shift of people of capital and business activity from C Corps to pass-through entities, precisely because the current taxation of pass-through entities is so much more beneficial than for C Corps, right? Because
it's just a single taxation rather than double taxation.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. It's easy to, as a C Corp, to end up getting taxed at a 50-60% rate because you pay the corporate income tax and you pay dividends or capital gains. Whereas on the pass-through side, right, you're maxed out at 43 or whatever the unearned income, whatever applies to what you're doing. So I'm not sure that it's a great idea, but there's immense pressure, I think, from a pretty important part of the Republican base to do something like this. But I agree with you that it seems like a nightmare, and it certainly doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would fundamentally simplify the tax code. And so that's something I tried to emphasize. At this point, the only simplification that they're really focused on is we're going from 7 rates to 3. But the hard part in doing your taxes is not that last multiplication step. I don't know. It's,
in the category of alternatives and simplification, is there any appetite at all for getting rid of all the taxes we're talking about and going to a straight federal sales tax? I mean, after all, what is it, something like 47 states have state sales taxes, so the system is set up, it works, it's collected at the time you buy something. April 15th is just another spring day. We get rid of a lot of the IRS criminals. The IRS would be reduced. I mean, it would be a dramatic change and would take a fair amount of courage. I know this idea sort of simmered for years, and there are some congressmen and senators who
there's some appetite for a value added tax masqueraded as something different. So Senator Cruz, for example, his tax plan was basically a nationwide value added tax that he called something like the business income tax.
Well, I'm talking about a sales tax, not value added. It would have to be.
But the sales tax is tough. A 35% sales tax would be very different, but would be very difficult to implement. Right. So the state sales tax rates are 10%, something like that.
Yeah.
If you want to have a 35% sales tax and implement it at the retail level, I would imagine that people would try to avoid paying that last step of the system. And I think certainly if you get a separate pass-through rate, a lot of people would have an incentive to set themselves up as a business and buy their groceries with their LLC. Presumably they wouldn't be subject to the sales tax.
Well, I don't know why not. If a business goes into a store and buys a widget, they pay the sales tax in the state, right?
Well,
they don't ask you whether you're a business or a personal.
If it's not intended, if you're not selling it, you don't pay taxes on it.
If you just go in as a company and buy a
Yeah.
widget?
It would have that would be massive enforcement problems. So it would have to look more like a VAT, and that for some reason that's locally poisonous among Republicans. I don't really understand why. So I think they're typically worried about it as a new tax because they think it's easy to. Exactly because you're saying it's so smooth, it's so easy to do, and April 15th would be just like any other day. I think people are worried that a value-added tax is too easy to implement and therefore too easy to increase. So I think both the national sales tax and the national VAT are tough. Also, one thing I'd emphasize is that we've seen that these guys have enough trouble coming up with any kind of fundamental transformation of any policy area. Certainly this seems like a pretty big thing to take on for them. Yes?
I've read the argument that the Republicans doing away with earmarks has made it much harder to pass legislation of this kind. Does that make any sense to you, that argument?
It does. So you see this constantly. So for example, your colleague Larry Summers, he often writes about his daily commute. That he doesn't like that bridge that connects the Kennedy School to Austin, and he doesn't like LaGuardia Airport. And so in response to that, he now wants a $1 trillion infrastructure package because he can't just go to his congressman and say, put an earmark in for that bridge. On a more serious note, yes, you hear this, right? That it's harder for leadership to control individual members. It doesn't. I mean, the House doesn't seem to struggle that much with passing things. So partially because their leadership decides who's on what committee and who's not. In the Senate, I mean, I don't know. Maybe they would have been able to get that. I mean, but maybe. I think the Senate has always been. I think earmarks have always been less effective there as bribing mechanisms.
Have you ever driven through West Virginia?
Sure, but
See how many things are named after Senator Byrd?
yeah, but I don't think that many of those things were named after him to bribe him into voting
Probably not.
for
Yeah.
non.
Reward him for having been bribed.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah. So I don't know to what extent that's true. I mean, I do think it's part of a broader set of things that have made it easier for elected officials to sort of go their own way. Right? It's a lot easier to raise funds outside of sort of party elite control channels these days. It's a lot easier to get media access outside of those channels. So I think all those things should matter. I'm not sure that we've seen it much in the health policy debates. So, like would John McCain have been more controllable by the leadership if there were earmarks? Murkowski got elected as a write-in candidate despite her name. McConnell is not going to be able to bribe her with stuff in Alaska. I think. I don't know. Yes. Oh, but let's go over here. Sorry.
With respect to the shifting of tax brackets or collapsing them, there's probably no greater ambiguity in politics today between the way that the proponents of that describe it and the way Nancy Pelosi describes it, both in terms of the impact on the different groups and in terms of the long-term impact on the budget. I just wondered what an objective person like yourself would say about what's generally we think is being proposed now.
Yeah. So I think there's two. Let's first start with relatively lower income households. So under the plan, they're expanding the standard deduction. They're getting rid of the personal exemption, and they're lowering the bottom rate a little bit. So I think that'll get rid of the federal tax liability of some households. The standard deduction doubling and the personal exemption elimination almost, they're almost the same size for people who will now be subject to the expanded standard deduction. So I think those households are, maybe made marginally better off. I think as you go up the income distribution, once you get to the third quintile, you're going to see sizable numbers of people who lose under the current framework under a reasonable interpretation of what they're going to do, precisely because the personal exemptions disappear, and because there you start getting people who use the state and local deduction. I think there will be some households between. I think if it all goes through the way Republicans want to go through, I think the households that are going to be the worst off are people who households make $250K, but are not subject to the AMT, have a mortgage and pay a high state and local tax. I think there's going to be some significant losses there. But there's also going to be some households that benefit from the lower second and third rate. Right, so there you're going to have more of a transfer within. So from 50 to 95, there's going to be winners and losers. Some of them somewhat sizable. On average, probably slight increase in after-tax income. And then the big winners are going to be the people who have a lot of pass-through income. If it goes through, people who pay the estate tax. That's not that many people, but that's a big tax cut. And then the whole corporate side cut is going to have, a growth effect that we don't know how big it is, but, reasonable to think that's sizable. So that'll add a little money to everyone. But, most of those gains will go to the top 5% as well, right? Because a lot of, when in the discussion, when people say how much of the incidence is on capital versus labor, Jamie Dimon is labor. I don't think people, like in common, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn, when he thinks of labor, thinks of Jamie Dimon as, one of its key constituents. So, there a lot of the gains will go to the higher end of the income distribution as well. Now, in part, that's just because that's where the federal income tax money comes from. So if you're going to do a proportional cut, it's going to be mostly beneficial to the wealthiest people. But of course, you can introduce whatever credits you want and have large. You can have phased out child tax credits and an expansion of the ITC. That's certainly not what this plan does, right? So this plan, even though I don't think it actively. I don't think it actively hurts anyone in the bottom 50% of the income distribution. I don't think it helps them that much either, except for through the corporate side.
And what does it do to growth in the deficit?
So the deficit, I think, will increase, and it's meant to increase it under the current budget resolution. On the to growth, it'll add a little bit. The corporate tax rate will be more competitive. Presumably, that'll draw more capital to the U.S. Both sort of real new investment and more sort of accounting shifts from countries that now prefer to leave their profit somewhere else. I think that second channel is often a little overstated, right, where people repatriate people can borrow against their foreign assets. Most of the non-repatriated money sits in banks in New York, right? It's loanable funds in the U.S. And in addition, the profit shifting is not toward Germany, right? The profit shifting is toward the Netherlands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, those places, right? Those are the tax havens, and the U.S. will still not be. Ireland, those will still not be directly competitive against those places. Yeah.
I assume the basic problem with the Affordable Care Act is it's expensive. And if you wanted to constrain the cost, can you actually do that while still having the principle that there's social insurance for everyone that basically covers whatever medical care they need? I mean, it seems as though sort of this, one approach is to say we don't want to have socialized medicine, and so you're on your own, and we can have all kinds of arrangements. But if you accept the idea of socialized medicine to that extent, is there a plan? I mean, is there someone at ABI who has a rational plan, or some other plan you've read that?
Oh, well, so then you'd have to do. But so if you were just saying, okay, we're picking up the bill for everyone, basically, right? No matter how we organize, and you can't have people. You can't reduce healthcare spending through the demand side that much if you want to do that, because you can't have people who make less than $40K a year, have a deductible of $4,000K, right? Because that doesn't fit the socialized medicine idea, right? So then you have to go to the provider side, and there are things there, right? So there are small things you can do. You can reduce the liability that doctors have, the legal liability they have, right? They'll shave off, 1.5% of spending. You won't get reimbursed as much if a doctor treats you terribly. But that may be a thing you'll be willing to do. You can just reduce Medicare reimbursement rates. That the federal government sets those rates. You cut them at 30%. Medicare spending goes down by 30%. Are a lot of doctors going to quit their jobs? Maybe. Maybe they'll work harder because the income effect is larger than the substitution effect. But there are large interest groups that oppose those changes, but those are in principle doable. There's pretty good work suggesting that Medicare prices basically affect all other prices in the medical industry. So that's the biggest lever the federal government has. I don't know if I mean, it's a weird world where conservatives have to decide whether they feel like the federal government should be allowed to use the pricing power endowed to it by the nationalization of an entire industry. I don't know what you want to do there. You could do that. You could close down rural hospitals and say we don't think that's something we should subsidize. If people want to have good health care, they should move to a city. Those are the choices you have to make. One of the reasons why Senator Murkowski was a key player in this is that Alaska has by far the highest medical costs in the country because it's Alaska. There's ice everywhere. You can do those things, but they involve tough choices. A lot of it is going to be irritating to doctors, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. And then a lot of it is going to be annoying to the most costly consumers, who are costly not just because of pure medical reasons. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, just a question about the consequences of the Republican approach to undermining the ACA under Obama. This is in some sense a question about colleagues of yours like Michael Grieva. So the strategy there...
Former colleague.
I
don't think we ever actually overlapped.
That's right, okay. So
George Mason professor.
That's helpful here,
Yeah,
right.
right.
Okay, so the strategy that Michael and others advocated was a litigation-based strategy, in part because Republicans were closed out of major legislative institutions to undermine the law. One consequence of that is that we now have Supreme Court rulings affirming the validity of large parts of the law. And so now a downstream consequence of that is that the Supreme Court has, some argue, sort of foreclosed major action because when the Supreme Court rules, there's nothing we can be done. So at the time, it might have seemed like Michael and others' strategy was sort of the optimal strategy, but sort of 7 years on, the fact that it was a litigation-based strategy, some argue has caused problems. So do you think that was a mistake, or?
Well, the fact that the Supreme Court has made things legal for the federal government doesn't mean that the federal government has to do them. Right? So in that sense, there's no harm done. And I think the constraint is still just the basic political one. The Congress could still repeal the individual mandate, even though it's constitutional. So I think that strategy, to the extent that they just wanted to, carve away at the Affordable Care, was pretty successful. And I don't think it's. It's not like, people came up with the individual mandate before they knew it was constitutional. They allegedly enacted it before they knew for sure that it was constitutional. And so that was never a binding constraint. Uncertainty about constitutionality was never a binding constraint anyway. Same on the mandatory Medicaid expansion. Right? The Democrats enacted that even though they weren't sure it was going to be constitutional. Right. So I think in that sense, I think we know from the legislative history that was not a binding constraint. So I think that because of that, it's not a problem.
If you were called in by the Republican group, the Congress and Senate, what advice would you give them to try to get something to happen?
To get something that, I don't know, I would say, cut Medicaid a little bit. Make these, phase out the subsidies a little earlier so they don't go up all the way into the middle class. And then focus on providers and try to get prices down through increased competition, through, letting more doctors practice. That'll be two effects, but surely you could get, there's a lot of,
What was that, getting more doctors to practice?
Yeah, you can have, there's the American Medical Association, it functions as a pretty effective cartel. You could let people start their medical training 4 years earlier, the way every other developed country does it. Maybe you don't want to do that, but that's obviously that you have to finance people's not medicine related college somehow, and typically that comes from future earnings, one way or another. Right? You could just say at age 18 you start studying medicine. You could have nurses do more tasks traditionally done by doctors. You could come up with a big push for e-medicine that like Jeb Bush had in mind when he had his sad low energy campaign for president. There's a lot of stuff, but they've been so focused on the Medicaid and individual market demand side that they have let everything else go.
Do you see anything actually getting through?
No.
Either the medical or the tax front?
I don't know. I think they're trying to forget about it.
Laura.
Do you think, how likely do you think it is that we'll ever move to a single payer system like every other developed nation has?
Well, very few nations have a single payer system.
Or universal healthcare system?
Well, the U.S. kind of is pretty close now. The uninsured numbers are pretty low by now. It's people who choose not to buy in the individual market, either because they've been priced out and they don't get subsidies. That's a very small group. And then there's younger people who say, well, I'll just pay the fine. The largest group is people who qualify, who are eligible for Medicaid or other programs but haven't enrolled technically, and undocumented immigrants who don't qualify. But, they don't qualify in most other countries either. But it's typically a smaller group. So the U.S. has universal coverage. A lot of countries have multi-payer systems. Switzerland and the Netherlands basically have health insurance markets that look like the individual exchanges, and they have competing health insurance firms. They don't have Medicare, they don't have anything like that. Right? So you have to remember, a big chunk of the U.S. health insurance market has already been nationalized. They're between Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA. It's not that, of course that's still three different public payers. It's pretty close to at least largely nationalized health insurance system. Yeah. It's just very poorly designed. It's not, so I don't know. I would, but to answer your question more, how likely do I think that there will be more of a shift towards socializing more of the system? I would think, if the Democrats ever manage to win an election again, that's presumably the first thing they'll do. Who are their experienced, charismatic politicians? So when President Charlie Crist, if he gets a Senate and House majority, then presumably they'll pass some sort of Medicare for all or something along those lines. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. I don't know who gets to go first.
But somebody who hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, that's why.
This may seem a bit naive, but if there wasn't any corporate taxes, profits would go up, stocks would go up, and personal income of investors would go up. Why not just tax it when it becomes personal income?
So we need revenue to buy things, like healthcare for old people. We could, of course, have a system that integrates the corporate and individual taxation. At the a lot of the share owners of large corporations are not taxed themselves, and so that's something we need to find a way around. Like pension funds, universities, we would have to find a way to tax them. Also, you'd get the opposite. You get something similar to what happened in Kansas, where people will move a lot more of their activities toward corporations, right? Because they would carry out their activities, run a profit, retain the earnings, and never get taxed. Right? So that's why. All these different tax rates in the end are a backstop to keeping all activity flowing to certain legal forms. Yeah. So I think that would be the mix of answers. Yeah. Yes.
Is anyone taking seriously the study out of the White House that this will result in an average that with bringing the cash back and lowering the rates will increase the average wages of workers by 9,000 or so? It seems to me that the cash comes back from is repatriated and it's going out in stock buybacks and
So they
special
just
dividends.
they just released a second report making the same claims. Full disclosure: the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors was my co-author on that Journal of Sports Analytics paper on Deflategate. So he has this good, strong, relevant background on these issues. The response to the first report is very aggressive, and I think that the specific estimates were very poorly argued for. They used wage to corporate tax rate elasticities from cross-country studies. It's not obvious that that's a deep fundamental parameter in the social sciences. And then they cherry-picked two studies and said, well, one is higher than the other. So the low one is a conservative lower bound on the effect. That's not how it works. They then rolled out a number of relatively supportive estimates by other academics. Larry Kotlikov was the most positive one. But his estimate was lower than the White House lower bound. And that's a long-run estimate. So his long-run estimate was $3,500 for the median household, as opposed to the White House's $4,000 lower bound. So I think that's a bad sign, right? When your most aggressive defender comes up with an estimate that's below the lower bound that you've come up with, I don't think that's where you want to be. But to be clear, most of that growth is supposed to come from capital deepening because of the lower rates in the long run, not because of just repatriation. A lot of it hinges on how big you think those growth effects are. I think the U.S. is large enough that it affects interest rates. So that's not typically true in the models that foresee the biggest effects. There is a massive non-C corp sector that is completely ignored by these estimates. I think it's a little on the high side.
Yeah, it seems to me that the history in the last 10 or 15 years, corporation has some extra cash around. It goes out in stock buybacks. If it doesn't go out in stock buybacks, all of a sudden they have a shareholder activist knocking on the door and looking for special dividends. It just doesn't make any sense to me conceptually.
So it really depends on how strongly you believe that what is holding back wage growth is limits on capital investment within the U.S. I don't know. These estimates are very difficult, and frankly, I'm a little disappointed they came up with numbers that are they're just a little too high. Like if they come up with numbers that were half the size, they would have had at least overlap between their estimates and those of outside people. I think that's where you want to be, even if you're trying to paint an optimistic, rosy picture. Kevin is a little of an outlier on these issues, and so he should know that he needs to. I don't think you want to be, if you're the CEA, I don't think you want to be the most extreme point estimate. Yes.
There's also a study out, and I sorry, but I don't remember the author, who claims that much of the tax burden of corporations is paid by the workers of those corporations.
Yeah.
Do you have any? Are you familiar with this? And
also, there's a bunch of studies that say this, and I think that's true. So this is one of the reasons why Democrats in their platform had a corporate tax reduction to 28%, I think, last time around. That makes sense, right? So some of the incidence is on workers, some of it is on owners, some of it is on consumers. What you have to keep in mind when you see that worker capital split is what I was pointing to earlier, that one of the workers is Jamie Dimon. Right? So this is not necessarily people at the bottom of the corporate hierarchy receiving the wage gains. But those, I think people believe that between 25 or 60% of the corporate tax incidence is borne by workers. Yes.
I wanted to get back to, in your last slide, your presidential leadership question. Think about Obama and the passage of Obamacare in 2010, and my memory is a little foggy, but there was the Cornhusker kickback and Louisiana Purchase and all the stuff that made that.
Public debate with Paul Ryan.
Yes.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of stuff.
So,
yeah.
How much do you think that's affected the lack of that?
Well, but there was some of that, right? So they had, for example, in the last healthcare bill, there was a massive amount of opioid addiction funding that eventually swayed Rob Portman. They had some special funding for states with a particularly low population density. And I think it applied to Alaska and one more. And so that, if you don't want it to be too obvious, because no one knows what we're doing here. So there was some of that. I don't think Trump has had a long-standing deep interest in healthcare policy. So I think that makes a difference. That it's hard for him to talk to people when he doesn't really know what the issues are. I also think just that the Democratic Party has had a long interest in creating universal health care coverage. I just don't think it's that big of an issue for most Republican elected officials. Not something they've, focused on much, and they're not as passionate about it. I think all those factors matter, but I certainly think that Trump could have been more effective in promoting these plans. Remember the first plan, the House version of the BRCA, he went out and called it mean, right? That's the opposite of a presidential push for enactment. So overall, I'd say yes, President Obama did a significantly better job at pushing his party's healthcare legislation than Trump did. Yeah. All these things are overdetermined, right? Because that's like John McCain is mad at him, so he votes no. It's not.
So McCain and Romney both, as I recall, put forth plans that aimed at something like universal care through tax, what really seem like vouchers that they call them tax credits. Is your sense that could be more cost effective than Obamacare, less bureaucratic?
It could certainly be more cost effective to just give people credit than to basically not put a cap on their spending. Of course, unless the supply side changes dramatically, the money's still going to have to come from somewhere, right? So if you, you shift more of the risk to individuals, and maybe that's fine. But certainly it's easy to come up with systems that are less costly to the federal government. And we can argue over whether we think that households with 2 kids and who make $80K a year should get their health insurance subsidized by the federal government. Maybe not.
But do you think there'd be much cost savings in people might, if there's, like a $5,000 tax credit for a family of 4, and that's going to get them a high deductible, kind of lower, cost option?
Maybe a little bit, but
will that sort of hold down the overall costs by?
Maybe a little bit, but those are not the big. The healthcare spending is pretty concentrated in very few people, so I don't. By just cutting down on PCP visits is not. I don't think that's going to make a significant dent in spending. But there will be some of those, and everything helps. Right? This is also the issue. People look for a golden bullet to suddenly take healthcare spending from whatever 17% of GDP to 9%, but it's a lot of different things that explain that difference. So for sure that helps. But it doesn't explain that full gap. Yeah. Yes.
Again, why nobody's touching Medicare costs? If you say that's the.
Why no one is touching? Because all the people who get Medicare are over 65 and they vote. And so if they are angry, then you lose your seat. And then
but I think
you have to go home.
It's mostly the supply side. It's like in Germany, whatever itemized.
Well, because anything that so it's a mix of the consumers being powerful and the doctors and the hospitals being powerful, and it's a system that people genuinely like, right? So it's very difficult to say, okay, we're going to cut all Medicare payments by 20%, because the doctors are unhappy. There's a lot of doctors in every district, and they're pretty well off, and they donate, and the consumers are going to be unhappy. So it's just that's politically that's just so difficult. But it's a lot easier to cut Medicaid because it's fewer people, they don't vote, and they're poor. I think this is a purely political.
So Democrats couldn't
consideration.
do that.
No. Well, plus they like Medicare.
And they won't in the future. So the costs will never go down.
They haven't gone down for the last 40 years.
Germany do it. you know?
Well, most other countries are much more comfortable with rationing and with price controls in the medical sector than the U.S. Not just electorally, people seem more open to those trade-offs going a little bit in a different direction. Right, the UK has like actual death panels, to decide what treatment do we pay for, what do we not. Right, even the fake death panels came with significant political risk here in the U.S. Imagine if they had actual power. I think that's the different countries have different political cultures.
At what point would the level of debt, somebody said the word deficit, now I want to say debt, become relevant to these policy matters?
Well, I think in the last month, we've learned that politicians care about the debt when the other party is in power. I think Japan has a 260% debt to GDP ratio. The U.S. is at 70, so we still got a way to go.
But they own all their own debt, or most of it, right?
Yeah, the Boss Bank or whatever it is, the postal bank.
Speaking as we are of divisive issues, and Harvey may rule this question out of order, but have you thought about immigration in terms of the political differences?
Well, I'm an immigrant, so I've thought about this a lot as I went through a long bureaucratic process during which the federal government repeatedly asked me if I had been an official in the Nazi government of Germany between the years of 1933 and 1945, without a shred of evidence, as far as I can tell. The differences are pretty clear there. Right? The Republicans had a candidate who wanted to ban Muslims from entering the country. I think the Democrats are now basically at the point where they oppose enforcement of immigration legislation, certainly once you're past that port of entry. So that's a big divide.
American people are generally, they're divided, but they're somewhere in the middle, so is there any, there's no resolution on those two you mentioned up here. Is there any resolution on immigration?
Well, so I think they may be able to do, weirdly, because immigration is not in the big reconciliation buckets, they may be able to pass more marginal legislation. So I think the expectation is that the DACA recipients will end up on some sort of path to citizenship as a part of the next continuing resolution. Who knows?
And a 2-mile wall.
Yeah, no, that's a moat. The only thing they've done is the Russia sanctions. It's not, it's not impressive. So I wouldn't be too hopeful. But if something happens, I would imagine it'll be marginal. Because both parties have so little, but especially the Republicans, have just so little room to maneuver. In a sense, the immigration issue now, I think, unifies the Republicans more than even tax. I don't know. Not super optimistic.
So does your platonic idea of the tax plan in the U.S. look like in mind, or what pricing do you have regarding healthcare?
I would like to have a VAT combined with some mechanism to maybe redistribute a little bit on top of that. Maybe some sort of corporation backstop, because you want to have limited liability entities, but you don't want people to be able to store all of their groceries in there. But I think that should be the move, right? To try and tax consumption more than saving.
Like Germany has done, we have a 20% VAT. That's
I think that's Well, but Germany also has all other taxes on top of that. Right, so that's the only reason to be a little hesitant. But you don't want. I think it's just adding tax instruments it's risky, because I think it'll just lead to.
When you say that, you mean instead of the tax.
Right. So this is the platonic one. I don't think it's very realistic, but that's what I would like. You just tax people when they consume stuff, and then you redistribute it by giving some fixed amount to people, and with that you can come up with any income distribution. Yeah.
Related to Harvey's question about constraints, our low interest rates, which we've had for quite a long time, has had the effect of punishing savor of reducing spending and growing assets. What do you think about our monetary policy in general and how it will affect decisions about the various topics we've discussed today in the years to come?
I think it's worked out better than people thought. So I think there was a lot of fear of hyperinflation from the sort of monetarist right in 2009, 2010. But I think the U.S. experience was much better than the ECB experience throughout those years. And the big difference, I think, was the more experimental quantitative easing policies. I think it's hard to argue that those were terrible. And I think that Yellen is doing a pretty good job at returning to reasonable interest rates at a pace, I must say, higher than I think people would have expected her to do 4 years ago. So I think I think monetary policy has been pretty good compared to, especially if you're comparing to all other policy areas. Like it's certainly been better than criminal justice policy or healthcare, or healthcare policy over the last 5 years, or even fiscal policy. Where what we're going to do apparently in fiscal policy was we did a stimulus spending, then we did massive austerity exercises while unemployment was at 10%, and now we're going to do a deficit financed middle class tax hike. So I think monetary policy has been pretty good. Mostly because it's been in the hands of people with economics PhDs.
The unwinding has only begun, though, right? I mean, it's $4 trillion, right?
Sure, the rates have been going up steadily. But the unwinding, so the unwinding goes automatically to some extent. Right? A lot of the contracts just expire if you do not buy new bonds. I don't think that's a big source of concern. So I think if you were worried about the expansion initially, because you thought it was going to trigger hyperinflation, then maybe the concern is now, as the drawdown happens, that real interest rates would be pushed down even further. I don't know. That's
Since we've sort of extended the perimeter here, do you see any effect with cryptocurrencies coming into play in terms of? I've heard some economists talk about the possibility of actually destabilizing the current monetary system and the central banks.
I don't know. I think we're still a little in the sci-fi stage for the cryptocurrencies. I think the most pressing current questions is how do we trace illegal purchases and money laundering and things like that. I don't think the current Bitcoin market has a direct effect on interest rates in a way that can be manipulated or that is sizable. Right? So I don't think we're at the stage where there are macro implications.
Are we headed there?
I don't know. I would imagine if we do, then governments will ban the use of cryptocurrencies to maintain their control over monetary policy. I don't know. This is not something I have well-developed views on.
I don't know that anybody does.
No, exactly. Well, it has crypto in the name.
Well, thanks very much. We have to stop. I loved very much the half of your talk that I understood.
Okay.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
And for showing your expertise.
Oh, there you go.
Thanks. This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Stan Veuger from the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., a Fronistarian, to use Aristophanes' word for think tank.
That's right.
Yeah, and he's an economist. He's from the Netherlands, so he graduated from college in where I see in Utrecht and in Rotterdam. Mm-hmm. All right, and but he got his PhD in Harvard in the economics department in 2012, working under Professor Martin Feldstein. And so here he is today. He's written a number of of papers and publications for AEI and published in different reviews. Among them, I especially note a defense of our hero Tom Brady on the Deflategate false pseudo scandal of a few years ago.
Journal of Sport Analytics.
That's right, and I understand he has another article coming out on LeBron James.
Yeah.
So, but he does. He's an economist who does. He's, how should I say, not an economic political scientist, as there are too many of in our department, but a politic economist who is, yes, an economist, but thinks very well politically. And he's going to talk today about health care and tax reform in the 115th Congress. So Stan Veuger.
Thank you very much, Harvey, and thank you for having me here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I hope the mic situation are of the purely regulatory variety. Right? So there are essential health benefits that need to be in health insurance policies now, and those are regulated those are to some extent regulated by statute. Similarly, you're not allowed to discriminate against potential consumers with pre-existing conditions within the Obamacare individual exchanges. So all of those things you cannot repeal through the reconciliation process, and so they meant that Congress had to work around those things. And that led to the trouble early on in the healthcare reform process, because by keeping the basic infrastructure in place, right, so the individual exchanges that were created under the Affordable Care Act in particular, by keeping that in place, it was hard to keep senators on the sort of libertarian right on board with the repeal process. And so in the first rendition of the healthcare repeal bill, the Medicare Reconciliation Act, Senator Lee, for example, from Utah, who's certainly not a pinko commie, voted against the repeal act because he felt that it was going to keep too much in place. And the process kind of went on from there. So there were people on the sort of libertarian side of the party who felt like the reform bill didn't go far enough. There's people on the more moderate, or people in states that benefited more from the Affordable Care Act who were skeptical about changes that led to coverage losses. And so the Republicans just never really came to a solution that fit all the wishes and desires and dreams. Repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, passed financial sector regulation, and passed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, right? Massive reorganization of the healthcare sector. So far, what legislation have we seen during the Trump administration? A few retractions of regulations through the Congressional Review Act. This is what House Republicans were really proud of in April. And then Russia sanctions that they didn't really want. Certainly the president didn't want, but that Congress forced upon him. And that's the entire harvest so far. Now, what has happened to those original legislative objectives that I mentioned? There's the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace. That has, I guess, basically failed. The tax reform plans have gone from very comprehensive and truly transformative to we're going to cut a number of rates and then we're going to reshuffle some money around to, from the other side's preferred groups to our preferred groups. The infrastructure spending bill that people were very high on, and that was really the core of the populist Trumpian agenda, I think has now been indefinitely delayed. There's been no substantive progress. It's not clear that any of this is going to happen, certainly not in this Congress. And then the perhaps core of the campaign side of the Trumpist agenda, the border wall, whatever, the Muslim ban, some sort of immigration reform bill. None of that has happened yet, and instead it's quite possible that we'll see the DACA executive order under Obama being turned into legislation with the continuing resolution a few months from now, right? So this doesn't look like a legislative agenda that is going ahead swimmingly, and so I'm going to talk today a little bit about how that happened and what elements look more likely to still be salvageable and which ones don't. So what was the strategy Republicans adopted early, around April, May? They said, okay, healthcare reform turns out wasn't as easy as we thought. We're going to run into trouble in the Senate, perhaps, with Democrats, so we're going to go through the budget reconciliation process. This will only require 51 votes in the Senate, or even 50 plus Pence. It'll limit what we can do in terms of the content of the legislation, but it'll make it procedurally easier. And then we're going to have a second reconciliation bill for the 2018 fiscal year, which they, could have passed in February, but ended up passing just 2 days ago, yesterday, I think, when the House budget, yesterday, the House passed the concurrent resolution. And so they gambled on this process that required only Republican votes, but restricted what they could do legislatively, certainly for healthcare reform. Right? So under the budget reconciliation process, only elements of legislation that are directly relevant to budgetary outlays are allowed to be incorporated. Plus, there cannot be an impact on the deficit more than 10 years out, right? So both of those things restrict what you can do in terms of repealing regulations, writing new laws to force people to do things, and they limit what you can do permanently because you have this no addition to the deficit restriction 10 years out. And so in healthcare reform, that's very important. So many of the things the Affordable Care Act did is good. Yes? All right. Excellent. So yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about health and tax policy in this Congress. My opening remarks will be about 20 minutes. Those will be focused on policy, and then afterwards in the Q&A we can discuss the politics of the matter a little more. I have 20 minutes to discuss all of healthcare policy and all of tax policy. Fortunately, only as it applies to the United States. I'm going to assume that most of you, have followed these debates to some extent, and I'm just going to highlight a few of the big questions and what's going to come in the next year. So this is more of a current affairs discussion than I think is typical for this group. And so let's get started. So in November, the Republicans, even though I don't think really expected it themselves, suddenly gained control of both houses of Congress and of the White House, and they immediately switched gears and started thinking, okay, now we can pass our entire agenda. So if you talked to especially House Republicans in January, they would say, okay, we're going to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act in February. Then in March, we're going to do tax reform. In April, we're going to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And then in May, we'll start going down the list of other priorities we have. That was optimistic, but in previous similar situations where both Congress and the White House were controlled by the same party, certainly early on in administration, a lot of legislation actually did get passed on big issues. So under Clinton, even when his healthcare reform plans sort of fell apart, it still passed gun control, don't ask, don't tell, family medical leave, NAFTA, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so he's probably the least impressive of these four. But if you look at Obama in his first 2 years in office, passed a massive stimulus